Hello, I'm Jane Vowles.
I'm Pami Natterson.
I am Sheila Ojuda.
I'm Kirsten Patterson.
I am Kamala Rampersad Silva.
This is Kali Chui. As CEO of this institute, I am pleased to be collaborating with other female leaders
who are working incredibly hard to improve governance practices in their regions.
It is noteworthy that even as the challenges of COVID-19 are impacting our governance practices,
in many boardrooms, women's voices are absent,
silent,
or go unheard.
Yet, it is clear that the economic impact of COVID-19 is devastating.
Not only in terms of the estimated $90 trillion lost globally,
but as we see happening in some countries,
emotions are running high with respect to dealing with very fundamental decisions
like economic recovery,
reopening borders,
vaccinations,
and freedom of choice.
We cannot afford to lose out on the contribution women can make
to solve some of these problems.
We welcome you
as you join us in this 3-part series
on women in governance to bring positive change.
Positive change.
Positive change.
A change where we embrace all our voices
so that we can all contribute effectively to making governance worldwide more effective,
inclusive,
and diverse.
In other words, let's stop competing
and begin collaborating.
Let's help solve many of these problems.
Greetings from north of Auckland, but I hail originally from Te Waiponamu in the South Island and belong to the Ngaitahu iwi, which I just noted, and that occupies most of the South Island of New Zealand. So I've been a chair and director for 24 years. I tipped out of corporate in 97 because I thought the board were all plonkers and I could do the job myself. Of course, it was a long, hard road and it took a long time with a lot of frustration. But my first board appointment came via the government. So since then, I've chaired boards both in private Māori organisations, not-for-profit, listed company, so a real mixed bag. Diversity is obviously important for all the reasons Susan One said, but most importantly of all, I think it's the performance improves. Research has shown that. So the other question we were asked to answer was how can boards support diversity? So I'll have to fess up that I'm as biased as the next person because I favour candidates that reflect my own background. And because I recognise myself in them, I usually like to appoint them. So my sort of down-home advice would be get to chair board appointment panels, of which, I've done many because the first hand that goes up on boards is to chair the REMCO. So if you're chairing the REM committee, then you usually get to lead the board appointment process. You need to make sure it's not management-led. A lot of boards leave it to the CEO, and that is not good practice at all. So as Susan One said, role description specificity about what you want, a D&I policy, which I wrote one for a board I'm on, and now they need to appoint a new person. They all looked at the policy and said, who wrote that? Because it's a construction sector, and of course, they don't figure they can find any women, even though I gave them about 6 names. So have that policy in place, and then they can't wriggle out of it. And as I said, get to chair board appointment panels, because you can then drive your particular agenda, because we are all biased. That's my down-home advice for the evening.
Thank you, Susan. Caren, I'd like to introduce Caren Rangi, and Caren, keen for you to share a bit about yourself as well.
Thanks, Julia, and kia ora everybody. In my language of Cook Islands Māori, my parents come from a small set of islands in the Pacific called the Cook Islands, and came to New Zealand so as immigrants. And I guess that's been a huge driver for me in putting my hand up to be on boards, because about 20 years ago, I looked around and I didn't see anybody that looked like me on a board. And yet, those boards were making lots of important decisions about issues that were important not only to me, but to the communities that I'm part of, let alone wider New Zealand. And so that started a journey for me into the big wide world of governance. And these days, I'm a professional director across 7 boards in the areas of arts, broadcasting, and health across New Zealand and back at home in the Cook Islands. And it's a patch that I really love, because I love the opportunity to contribute to making great decisions. And I think that's, for me, is the underpinning point as to why diversity on boards is important. Because when you sit at those boards, you are there to make great decisions. And if you're a really responsible director, then you'll want to do that in the best way possible. And as Susan's already said through the research and the points that she made, great boards that make great decisions are ones that reflect a diverse and varied range of viewpoints, worldviews, skills, and experience, and have found a way to make a bit of magic out of combining those things into decisions that are strategically significant for the organisation. So again, a bit of a no-brainer. In terms of how boards can better support diversity, well, in my view, it starts right back from identifying what is the purpose of this organisation, right? The governance 101 that they say to you that you really need to be clear on when you're a board director. But the next question you need to be asking is that if you're clear on the purpose, then what is the ultimate range and variety of skills, experience, worldviews that you think you need sitting around that table? So that identification of the diversity that's strategically significant, that's needed, is really important. But identifying it is not enough. The next thing is actually understanding the differences. And I guess that's a responsibility on us as individual directors, but also boards as a whole, to lead those conversations, to say, how much do we really understand about the context that our colleagues are bringing to the table, but the context of the people that we're serving. But even that's not enough, right? So identification first, understanding next. We all know that unless we value those views, then they don't kind of get a look in. And I think, for me, a great board is one that's got to the stage where it's done the identification, it's worked on how well as a board it understands diversity of views, but it very actively and proudly and practically values difference, and that's reflected not just in its policies, but in the way that it manages its relationships around the board table and relationships with those that it serves. And for me, diversity is one of the biggest indicators that you can give as a board to say you value difference and you value the views of those that you're serving. And if we're not being diverse, we risk not being relevant. And if we're not relevant, we're not credible. So fairly straightforward, and I know it's not just as easy as that, but I do think there's some really fundamental attitudes as directors that we need to bring to the table in terms of identification, understanding, and valuing difference in relation to the strategic purpose of our organisation.
Well, look, thank you, Caren. That's some very wise words and insights. Before I sort of move on to ask each of you a number of questions, I'm conscious, Susan, you did a great keynote presentation for us. Is there anything more about yourself that you'd like to share, or sort of any other comments before I get into the general panel piece? You're on mute.
Here we go. I think everybody's learned about me already, but what I would say is that I think I am a typical example of one of those women that hasn't come up through the traditional pathways that we might see our male colleagues come through for governance. But that didn't mean that I wasn't gathering a lot of skills along the way. I've owned small businesses, which have been successful. I've had a large corporate career, and combining those skills have actually broadened my capabilities quite extensively. And so therefore, I may not have been that typical profile of what we might look for a commercial board, but it doesn't mean I haven't got the skills to do it. And I think that's very typical for a lot of women as well. So and that's why I say look for women in diverse places or different places, because they are there and they can do a great job. The other thing, look, both of my colleagues have given a great example of why boards matter, and I've spoken that already. But to me, I think it's important to acknowledge that if you only look at the world through one lens, then you're going to miss all of the other points of view and voices at the table. And we're not going to be richer for it. So again, just makes good business sense. It's the right thing to do. And we just need to get on and get it done.
Great. Look, I'll start with a question really to the three of you and just get some perspectives. We've talked about the issue probably in a personal way, but also in a theoretical way. I'd be really keen to get some quite practical examples of where you might have seen, really good corporate policies that support women on boards and broader diversity, and that would be, possibly at a board level in an organisation or amongst executives, etc. And can you give us any examples of what good looks like?
I can kick off if you like.
Thanks,
Julia.
Susan.
So Sport New Zealand has taken a wonderful leadership position where they fund most of the sports in New Zealand to a large extent, some of them fully. And it's all government funding. And so they have put a mandate in place where all sport boards must now have 40% women, and that comes into action in December of this year, or they don't get funded. So it's that carrot as well as a stick. And then they're moving next year to ethnicity thresholds. So I think that that's fantastic, and the sporting boards are scrambling to meet that. Just one other point that I did think of, Julia, I've sat on boards with complete Māori makeup, and there's a shortage of diversity on those. And I've sat on boards with too many women as well. So the opposite of, the balance is everything. Too many of anything is not good for diverse thinking around a board. And the last point is boards don't spend enough time, or if any, on talent and culture. It's a very narrow spectrum, and it might only be the CEO's, performance measures. And really, it should take up 10-15% of each board meeting. So if it did, I think we'd do much better.
I agree. Caren, did you have any comment?
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up a point that Susan One mentioned in her presentation about the work going on in the public sector here in New Zealand, where half of my boards that I'm on sit, and the big push towards getting at least 50% of women on boards, and it was great to be able to celebrate that this year. What was also great, though, was people saying we can't just stop there. So that's a great start, and that was a good target to have, but what are the next targets? So I think good policies are the ones that don't just stop when we've got to a certain place. They recognise that we've got to continually work towards getting stronger, diverse boards. So don't rest on our laurels, celebrate, but then move on. And I do think that what will help us moving on in order to really get boards that reflect the people that we're serving is a few more conversations that actually make the link between the attributes that women bring and to the success of the organisation, actually joining the dots for people, because they don't always see it. So I think more stories about the success of not just of individuals, but of the combination of individuals at a board table would really help out there.
So I've got a slightly different question, which I'll ask Susan one, and it has come through. So I'm going to jump around between panel questions I've got for the panel and questions that are coming up on the screen. And interestingly, one of the questions on the screen is one that I had jotted down for Susan one as well. So I'll just read it out. It's from Ronnie Cooper. It says, "Kia ora, Susan and KP." Susan one, I'll ask you. Do you have any thoughts on what support might be needed for women who are the sole female on a board? And I'd also made that comment as well. So I've certainly been in that situation myself, where I've gone onto boards where they have never had a woman, and gradually we've increased the numbers. Do you have any views around that? And I'll make some comments to you as well.
I would probably be really interested in your own comments on this one. This is a really difficult issue when we have only one of any other, whether it's one male, one female, or one person who is of different ethnic backgrounds. It is really difficult. And it's difficult because that voice can get overlooked and not only overlooked, but disregarded, because we haven't got the critical mass. The best thing we can actually do is just get more women on the board, because as soon as you add one more voice or two more voices, which is considered the critical mass, then you will get real penetration onto that board. It's a very difficult issue.
It is, and I think you do have to try and have someone that's prepared to hold their own as the first, otherwise
That's right.
Will get really, really swamped. Just leading on from that, and I'll jump to Susan too now. Susan, you spoke, obviously you've got Maori governance as well in your DNA, and New Zealand has tried in some instances, particularly in the public sector, to include one Maori person on a board. But probably from an inclusion perspective, the question is as relevant to you in that respect with a one Maori voice on the board. Is that a fair comment?
One and done.
And done.
I think it's unfair, and I've experienced it, and I'm sure Caren has too, where you get the cultural loading. So you sit on a board and you have to do all the heavy lifting because no one else has got the capacity to liaise with the Māori trust that no one else wants to talk to. So there is that is a real thing. The other one, the good thing with Māori organisations is the tribal entities. The top 9 of them control about 6 billion in assets. In that the number of women sitting on those boards is 60%. So we're on the right track there, but obviously more you can do. So I think it's difficult, but it's a pick up the pace.
So Susan, just moving on from that, I know obviously in terms of the tribal organisations, there is good representation from a Maori and a woman perspective. But how do we actually, in the broader commercial or not-for-profit or other spaces, support Maori women and actually probably more Maori more broadly into governance, and also the recognition of Maori stakeholders to those organisations? What's success looking like?
So obviously more people at the board level, and I think there is an intentional push towards that, but it all boils down to the chairs, I think, and being champions of that diverse makeup of the board. So that's a leadership issue, because the people are definite, the people are there. I was sat on a board appointment panel last week, I think, and the spec was for a Māori with community networks, and you would have all seen those sorts of ads, and into a space that they wanted to move into strategically. And then, of course, the board appointment panel met, and 2 of the members said, well, the candidates don't have enough governance experience. So it's that old chicken and egg, and Susan Doherty's nodding her head. So that I'm still working on that, and it's going to take me a lot longer to get them there. But because I chair the panel, I can, coerce and wear them out basically, and then put around that individual who isn't experienced but has all the, does fit the job description, put around mentoring and professional development, because you can see talent, you can recognize it, and you just need to develop it, as someone did with me 24 years ago.
And that's exactly right, isn't it? It's getting that first rung on the board. Someone was talking earlier about someone with a huge number of board roles, and it is once you've got roles, everyone wants you for other roles, and it's very, very hard to get that first rung on the board. And I do think, as a woman on a number of boards, it's really, really important to try and advocate for that diversity piece, because you can have different stages of governance. As long as you've got a number of people on a board with good governance skills, then it's a really important role to bring through new governors and new people that are our boards for the future. Caren, I'd like to take up on both Susans and the next question. Both have sort of referred to, well, Susan 2 was talking sort of a bit more about inclusion, and Susan 1 made a comment about, one of the absolute essentials was a diversity and inclusion policy with measurable objectives. But from your perspective, how do we get beyond just diversity to sort of true inclusion?
I think there's a couple of things. I think, first of all, it's the board as a whole recognising that everybody's got responsibilities in this case. So there have been times when I've, arrived at a board and felt like people are saying, oh, great, the diversity's here, we can all relax. And yet, as an individual, you're one part of a group. So my question to boards who are really serious about diversity and inclusion is, what are you doing every single time that you recruit somebody new to reorient yourself to receive a different point of view? Because it's not just up to the individual to make that change for the board as a whole. And yet quite often, if you think about traditional induction processes, right, they're all about the new person getting into line with everybody else. But where is the recognition of the valuing of difference there? It's saying, we want you to be the same as us. So I think there's some real rethinking around, and I'm a big fan of kind of reinduction of the whole board every time, because you're a different board, just whether it's one new person or half the board is new. And unless you recognise that right up front, as soon as the new person joins, there is a risk that you miss an opportunity to really understand what it is that, first of all, they think that they can bring to help the organisation be strategically successful, but also you miss the chance to reflect as a board to say, yeah, actually, here's some new thoughts or some new views. So, and I think a lot of the onus comes back to the chairs, and I think chairs have more responsibility than ever before to be the leaders and the eyes, because they're the one person who sits back and goes, are we working together as a cohesive unit? Are we making the most of what we have as the table at the table? And the anchor for that thought should be, what are we here to do again? And how can we best do that with the people that we've got? And because I'm obsessed with food, for me, it's the analogy is that it's one thing to have great ingredients, but you got to have the right recipe, and you've got to know how to cook with them. Otherwise, you just end up with a really mucky curry. And, so it's not just the individuals, it's the plan for how you combine their diverse views and worldviews and experience. And again, how you pin it back to the purpose of the organisation. So I'm probably sounding like a broken record, but I do truly believe there isn't enough anchoring back to the purpose. And I'm just as a last comment, I'm pretty sure that, and I would guess that for Susan too, it's the same. I often have people saying to me, I'd really like to have a person from your community on my board. But when I question them, say, well, what is the strategic significance for you of having someone like me on my board? They can't answer it, which tells me they haven't done their homework.
Very, very wise comment there, Caren, and thank you. Look, I'm going to ask a question to Susan 1 this time. And Susan, in your presentation, you did talk about the need to get good talent, but where do you get good candidates from? And it's really, there is that old piece of sort of shoulder tapping, people throwing names into a hat of people that they know, as opposed to doing a really good exec search. What I'd like, there's also a question online, which I think sort of links into that as well. So I'd like to wrap the two parts in together. And it's from Kate College, who says, what are some of the best ways for women to take the first step out of executive management and into governance roles? So how do they go about it when we still have, in many circumstances, that whole culture of shoulder tapping?
Oh, there's a lot to unpack on that question. I think, firstly, it's about, for women who are wanting to embark on governance, it's about firstly making sure that you're broadening your personal experiences as well. And I think, again, not-for-profit boards are a great place to start. Even the trustees of your school board is a great, excuse me, great place to start as well. Excuse me, I'm just going to choke on some water here. What was the first part of your question? I've just lost the thread.
Oh, my first part of the question was really where do you get the in terms of candidates' best talent?
Yeah, and I think, look, this is where we do need to fish in different ponds to the one pond that we tend to traditionally fish in. And so therefore we're circulating the same director talent around boards, particularly in New Zealand. That's what we're doing. And even with the amount of women that we have in our pools, we haven't got enough of them. So again, it's increasing the workload for a lot of our professional director women, and that's not a healthy outcome as well. And we're not making enough space for other women to join in there. I think it's, first of all, I would challenge your search companies that are often undertaking this recruitment on behalf of the boards. Firstly, it must be a requirement that they're returning to you a long list at least of perhaps 50-50 in terms of gender representation. And if they're not, then just keep pushing it back until they do. It's up to those search companies to really start looking into different networks and different peer groups that women might be operating within. And within that as well, I think it's about the board actually creating their own future database of potential candidates. And that's about really looking at broader talent, perhaps having a network or establishing a network that you can ultimately tap into at the time that you have an appointment come up. So it takes a lot of work, and it will be hard work, but actually it will bear the fruit at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Just to follow on from that, Susan, my dozens of boards, the majority of them haven't come through search firms. They've come to, it might be a symptom of New Zealand, but it's come through networks.
Right.
And it's far less informal. So it's very hard to catch that fish, and you just have to keep working it. I remember years ago, a young woman came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm leaving exec," and I said, "Well, you should get a board appointment before you leave." She said, "No, I'm going to be full-time in 2 years." And I said, that's really difficult to do.
That's right.
In a small and not well remunerated profession. Exactly.
Particularly on the smaller boards.
Mm. Well, I think it is a real challenge where the net has not been cast wide enough at the moment, and we are just finding that the same names are coming through, and it is a very, very difficult thing. I mean, my suggestion for someone that is looking at going into board roles is to try and think about why you want to do it, and what skills, what do you bring to the table? What's your unique piece that you can really, particularly from your first role, really add some value in, and be quite hard on yourself, but be quite constructive as well in terms of just trying to find out what is your unique piece about yourself. And then I would actually look at the director community out there and try and see who has got an established director career that you might be what I would call a mini-me of. So, you're at your early stage, but they're more developed, but actually you've got some real similarities. And I would suggest you try and get someone to connect you with those people and try to understand their journey, because it's what I did, and it was certainly incredibly helpful to me to really get the wisdom of those that have gone before. And people are generally very happy to spend some time and talk about their own pathways as well. So I strongly suggest for those that are looking at getting into governance, it's quite a good way of doing it. I have another question here, and it's great that it's from a male, so I'm definitely going to ask it. And actually, I think, who shall I ask? I'll ask Susan too this one, because you've had quite a bit to do with the IOD through time. But it says from John Ben, and it says, within New Zealand, should male chartered fellows and distinguished fellows start leading the discussion and set the tone on the boards they're likely to chair? Should this group also undergo specific training on equality issues? It's a loaded question. There you go.
I think definitely lead the discussion. That would be great. And I note, that drives me mad, but Rob Campbell leads that conversation a lot on LinkedIn in New Zealand. So definitely open up the conversation, see what pops up, and see where it goes.
Oh, that's great. Caren, one for you. Do you think it's useful to look, this is from Gemma Carroll, so do you think it's useful to look at board composition through a sustainability lens, i.e. if you're not diverse, you're not sustainable?
I think that's a great point from Gemma. And again, it harks back to what do we need to be successful now and in the future, which is quite a different, quite a hard question to answer when you're interested in recruiting in the here and now, right? You want to have the best decision makers right now. But I think if you do cast your sights, further to say, well, what are we going to need to be fit for purpose in the future? We want to still be around in the future. Then I think it does give you a different lens through which to consider who would be a suitable director now. You might be more inclined to look for someone who's not so experienced at governance, but perhaps has expertise in an industry where you're wanting to head to, or where you want more understanding of. So I think that's a really, really great approach to take. But what it also twigs for me is how much more work we can all be doing as female directors on setting new metrics for what makes a great board member. So there seems to be a bit of a default back to, if you've got great technical skills, somehow you will miraculously become a great board member. Whereas I think we all know it's relationships that make the world go round. So really it's your interpersonal behavioural skills, which you can apply at the board table, use to take your technical skills, input into the discussion, that for me make the magic on great boards. If I think about the ones that I really enjoy, it's where people have got quite a high level of EQ. They kind of know what they're good at, they know what they're useless at, they understand the impact of things that they're saying. So I think for me, one of the missions I'm on is to kind of rewrite the report card for what makes a great board director in this point in time, but also to be fit for purpose in the future. And for me, it would be less focused necessarily on technical skills and more around the ability to take that knowledge, that skill, that experience, be able to recognise and value the different ways that people have relationships and put that all towards really great collective decision making, because that's what governance is about.
Thanks, Caren.
Can I just comment on that? Because
yeah.
I think, one of the things I was talking about earlier was we really need to rethink the selection criteria, really rethink some of the characteristics that we're looking for from our board members, because bringing all of that difference to the table actually really creates a challenging and rich conversation. And this is where I think the board chair is so essential, but it's also so worrying that we've only got such a minority of women as board chairs. But the board chair really sets the tone, really opens up the table and creates that culture at the table. So I think you're right on the money with that one, Caren.
Just to put a different slant on things, I've interviewed hundreds of men and women for board roles, and I'm surprised at how many haven't researched enough. They haven't read the strategy, they haven't listened into they're just ill prepared. So it's a serious business, and when you get an interview, when you take it very seriously and research everything in the public domain, and anyone that you might know, bring them up even if you don't know them, to get the background on the organization, because then you'll show intention again. And then just very quickly, I mentioned about Māori governance coming closer together with te iwi, or mainstream governance, and which is a great thing, and it's moved significantly in the last probably 5 years. So I don't think that, I always ask what's the difference between mainstream and Māori governance, and I haven't got the answer quite yet, because we're all subject to the same legal and risk and strategy and human capital sort of requirements, but we just come at it from a different worldview.
Look, Susan, that's great. And I just actually want to read out another question here, which actually sort of ties into the first part of what you were saying there. It's from Siobhan Hartwell, who says, look forward to a time when women are selected for their skills, not gender or cultural background. The reach has to go back into schools and universities, and women coming through, seeing what is possible. Really agree with the discussion, re-mentoring. What are the skills you often see that are missing? And I'm interested for you to comment on that, and also your comment earlier where you were talking about people not going to the interview, sort of really understanding the strategy, etc. So
what's missing? Was that the question from?
Yeah, what skills that you often see are missing?
Oh, I can. Everyone can imagine with women, there's financial literacy missing. It just doesn't come through the natural sort of executive or non-executive pathway. So they have to scurry around and upskill, and some of them don't, and they just rely on usually the male accountant on the board. So that's gross generalization, but I've seen it time and time again. So that's the main one. Everything else is intuitive, and common sense applies. But obviously the technical skills of finance are something that needs to be learned.
So I agree with that, but I just might give a slightly broader perspective as well from where I sit. Obviously, my experience is in the listed board space, and normally you'll start with, a skills matrix. What are we missing? But I do think that we actually have to step back when we're looking at candidates for roles. We actually have to step back and say, what is really important. And I think historically, one of the issues, certainly in the commercial space, is that we've looked at value to shareholder and not value to stakeholder.
Yeah.
And I think as companies, certainly in the corporate space, are starting to move to a far greater recognition that to be around for the longer term, we really have to meet our social license to operate, and we really need to think about that broader stakeholder piece. Then I think that we will find that the richness that we get around a board table is going to be enhanced by that diversity. And I think that that's really some of the conversation that many women, they have got very good skills across the board, but they might not have been the CFO, or they might not have been the whatever it might be, but still bring an enormous richness to the table, particularly when you put the stakeholder lens on and take that slightly longer term view about the organisation. And I think it also then ties back into one of the things that New Zealand is rich for is if we look at the Maori lens in terms of taking a longer term view about what a sustainable entity looks like, and actually I think a Chinese lens as well, which is, has a much longer time frame than what we have tended to do historically here. So I just do think that that's a perspective that women can add and bring.
Can I pick up on this, Julia?
Yeah.
I've got just a slightly different take, which perhaps lends itself more to maybe ethnic diversity. But one of the conversations I've been having recently with my own communities in the wider Pacific community, from people who are interested in getting into governance, is really encouraging people to recognise what experiences they have culturally of collective decision making, because after all, governance is about great collective decision making, right? And so for me as a Cook Islander, I come from a community that's practiced great collective decision making for thousands of years out of necessity, or else we would have died out as a people. And I think sometimes we don't always value the different sorts of collective decision making experience that we might get because it's not in a formal board situation. But I know, again, as a Pacific person, that not a week goes by where I'm not involved in some kind of collective decision-making process, whether it's culturally, whether it's socially, whether it's religiously, whether it's in the wider tribe or clan. And so I think sometimes just reminding people that there are other ways of getting skills that are really useful at the board table that don't necessarily come through the formal, experience on a board. And that gets down, though, to people really, really being clear on what the role of a board member is. And that's, again, where I think there is a bit of a gap. I actually think a lot of people think they know and think it's easy, but they don't, and it's not.
Excellent point. Look, I am being jimmied along here because in 2 minutes' time I have to wrap this up so that everyone can have 5 minutes to grab a cup of tea or coffee and be back for our Hong Kong colleagues that are starting at 8:30 New Zealand time. So I'm really sorry. We've got some fantastic questions that are sitting here in the Q&A. I can't get to them all. I'd love this to have gone on longer and been able to ask at the panel. So I'd just like to acknowledge our fabulous panel, Susan 1, Susan 2, and Caren. And Susan 1 also for your great presentation earlier. So look, it's been a real pleasure to host you here tonight. Good evening from New Zealand. We will pass over to our friends in Hong Kong. So thank you all, and thank you very much to the panelists.